I arrived in Alaska at the end of September with a small suitcase and a contract that seemed way too big for a night janitor. The outsourced company had a generic name. On paper, the address was just Site K41, Night Maintenance Sector. No city, no street. The plane landed in Fairbanks early in the evening. When I felt the air, I understood that the cold here isn't just about temperature. A driver was waiting with a sign, Ethan Cole. He didn't say welcome. He just pointed to an unmarked white van. The ride to the site took hours down identical roads. Dark pine trees, packed snow, heavy sky. The radio stayed off. When we arrived, I didn't see a building. I saw a tall fence, a gate with bright lights and cameras. A voice on the speaker asked for a code. The gate opened slowly, like the place was breathing. I was taken to a small annex, like a construction office. A heater made noise, and the smell was of old coffee. A man in a gray lab coat was waiting. "Dr. Malcolm Reeves," he said, and shook my hand quickly without really looking at me. He handed me a badge with my photo and a number. The photo was already printed, which I found strange because I didn't remember taking one for this job. "Keep this visible at all times," he said. "Over your clothes, no exceptions." Then he placed a black notebook in my hand. Small, thick, hard cover. "The rules," he said. I smiled politely, thinking of the usual stuff. No smoking, no filming, don't go into the wrong room. I'd worked in places with rules before, and it was usually just red tape. But the first page of the notebook had a warning in big letters. Deviation from protocol results in immediate termination. Not warning, not suspension, termination. And it didn't feel like it was just about losing a job. The word hit me like it meant something else. The rules were simple, but way too specific. Exact times, hallways with strange names. One said, "Enter through the service entrance between 10 Hs p.m. and 11 Hs p.m. Do not use the main entrance during the night shift." Another, "If your badge changes color, exit through the nearest emergency door." I read that one twice. Badges don't change color. I thought of sensors, thermal ink, maybe some kind of test. There were rules for lights. If the lights dim for 10 seconds, keep working. Do not stop. Rules for stains. If you find a clear liquid, do not clean it. Mark the spot and report it in the morning. And there was one that gave me chills. If you hear someone calling your first name, do not answer. I looked at Dr. Reeves, expecting some kind of explanation. He just said, "You don't need to understand. You just need to follow." He said it like he was giving simple advice. Then he added, "The night shift gets easier when you don't try to be clever." My job was basic. Mop hallways, take out regular trash, restock paper and soap, clean service areas. I wasn't supposed to touch any machines. I wasn't going into important rooms. I was supposed to be someone who passed through and left no trace. In the first week, the routine became automatic. I entered through the service door, went through an airlock with bluish light, put on gloves, and pushed the cleaning cart. The hallways were white and windowless. The sound never changed. A low humming like a giant freezer and air moving through the ducts. It wasn't empty silence. It was a full silence, like too many things were running at once. I almost never saw people. Sometimes, near the end of the shift, I'd spot a security guard from a distance. The rest of the time, I was alone. That should have been a good thing. I've always liked working without anyone watching me. But there, I sometimes felt like the place was watching me anyway. The notebook kept coming back to my mind. It was way too normal to be a joke and way too weird to be just a safety manual. Some rules felt like they were written for things I hadn't seen yet. If the storage room door is cracked open, do not close it. If you find a mirror where there wasn't one before, cover it and leave. I had never seen a mirror in there. Still, the rule was there, like someone was sure that could happen. And then there was the badge. This is going to sound stupid, but sometimes it felt too heavy. Not the plastic itself. It was like pressure on my chest, like I was carrying something that pulled at me. I'd get to my plain little room and feel like taking it off and putting it far away. But another rule said to keep it on me until I left the site perimeter. So I did what I've always done in life. Followed instructions. I cleaned. I didn't ask questions. I avoided thinking about what happened there during the day, and most nights that worked. I finished my shift, stored the card, filled out the report, and went back to my room, with the wind outside and the system's humming still in my ears. But even when nothing happened, I started feeling like nothing happening was part of the job too. Like the place was waiting for me to mess up. Like my job wasn't to clean the floors, but to prove, night after night, that I knew how to follow orders. And I hated admitting that too. In the second week, I stopped counting days and started counting routes. At Site K41, time didn't feel like a number on a clock. It felt like a path on the floor. Always the same, always clean, always leading me to the same doors I wasn't allowed to open. The first strange things were too small to turn into a story. The kind of stuff you explain away with being tired or distracted. A noise here, a flicker there. Things that if I told someone in Fairbanks would turn into a haunted place joke. And I didn't want to be that guy. It happened on a Tuesday, around 11:20 p.m. I was mopping the east hallway, the one that connects the supply rooms to the service stairs. The background sound was the usual, ventilation and fluorescence. Then came a different noise, really faint, like someone lightly tapping the metal in the duct. 3 quick taps, 2 slow ones. I froze mid-mop because it felt intentional. I pulled out the notebook from my pocket and flipped through until I found a rule about repeating sounds. I didn't even remember reading that part before, but it was there. If you hear tapping in the ventilation system, count the pattern. 3 fast, 2 slow, ignore. Any other sequence, write it down and leave the hallway. That was it. 3 fast, 2 slow. Exactly. I kept cleaning, but I had a bad taste in my mouth. Like when you realize a traffic sign had been warning about an accident before it even happened. I didn't know how someone had predicted such a specific pattern. I just knew the rule existed, and that it had been right. 2 nights later, I saw the first light change. It wasn't a blackout. It wasn't a power failure. It was like someone had decided to dim the lights just to remind me they could. The lights in sub-level 2 went dim for exactly 10 seconds, then came back. I know it was 10 because I started counting without meaning to, in the middle of the scare. When it ended, I was already on the page in the notebook that talked about it. If the lights dim for 10 seconds, keep working, do not stop, do not look at reflective surfaces during the dimming. I don't remember thinking about looking at reflective surfaces, but I do remember wanting to look at the glass on the storage room door like something inside me wanted to check for something. I didn't look. I just kept walking and mopping like it was a test I couldn't afford to fail. By the 3rd week, the list of little things started to grow. Not like a story that gets more exciting. It grew like a spreadsheet filling up with bad numbers. One night, I found a clear puddle on the floor, near the curve that leads to the electrical cabinets. It looked like water. No smell, no color. My first reaction was to grab the squeegee and clean it up, because that was my job. But the rule said not to. I marked the spot on my map and left the puddle there, shining under the light like a patch of liquid glass. The next day when I came back, the puddle was gone. No stain, no trace, nothing. Just dry, clean floor, like I'd imagined the whole thing. I hadn't been drinking. I didn't use drugs. I slept as much as I could. I knew what I'd seen. And still, there was nothing. I started to realize the rules weren't just do this to avoid problems. They were more like, do this so you don't become part of the problem. In the 4th week, I saw someone. It was a security guard at the end of a hallway, standing near an unmarked door. He had his back to me, and I could tell by his posture that he was tall. I was just going to walk past. Talking to security wasn't my job, but then he slightly turned his head like he could sense me without looking. And then he said clearly in a normal voice, Ethan. Just my first name. I felt my hands go cold, even with gloves on. The rule about names came into my mind like a reflex. If you hear your first name, do not respond. I kept pushing my cart, eyes on the floor like I hadn't heard anything. The silence that followed was worse than the call. He didn't insist. He didn't say anything else. All I heard was the soft sound of footsteps walking away, slow, unhurried. I spent the rest of the shift trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe he read my badge. Maybe it was just some guy trying to be nice. But then again, why would a rule need to tell you not to respond to that? And why did I have the feeling that If I had answered, I would have been confirming something. The following week, the intercom spoke. That wasn't supposed to happen. At least that's what Dr. Reeves had said, and the notebook repeated it. No announcements between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. I was on sub-level 3, cleaning an area where all the doors looked the same, when the speakers crackled, and a calm female voice said, "Maintenance worker, confirm presence." I froze. The cart stopped. The sound hung in the air, way too clean to be static. I tried to act like it was just a test, like I hadn't heard anything. I went back to mopping, but my hands were shaking. The voice repeated exactly the same, emotionless. "Maintenance worker, confirm presence." I didn't answer, and it stopped. The worst part wasn't the voice. It was the feeling that the building had waited for my reply. Like, for a few seconds, everything had paused, ready to move to the next step if I said the right word. After that, I started noticing things in the details. Doors that seemed too tightly shut, cables that looked too neatly arranged, trash cans showing up empty at times when I clearly remembered seeing them full. It wasn't disorder, it was the opposite. It felt like someone was trying to make everything perfect, but didn't quite understand the human way of doing perfect. And then, there were the looks. Whenever I saw someone from a distance, a tech, a guard, someone in a lab coat, they stared just a little too long. It wasn't curiosity. It felt like they were calculating. Sometimes the person would say good evening in a very proper tone, like a trained airport employee. And I guess that should have been normal. But down there, deep underground, it felt rehearsed. The notebook also started to shift in my mind. The rules, which used to feel just annoying, started to feel like answers. Like someone had been through all this before and left instructions so the same mistakes wouldn't be made again. And with every new little thing, I realized something bigger. Site K41 wasn't just a place I worked. It was a place that reacted to me. What used to be just a strange hallway became an entire floor filled with small signs. What used to be one isolated rule became a full set of boundaries. Like my shift was a line I wasn't supposed to cross. I still hadn't seen anything I could point to and say, "That's a monster." But I already felt, strongly, that I wasn't alone during my shift. And worse, I started to feel like that wasn't an accident, it was a system, and I was part of it. I tried to explain everything in a normal way, because that's what I did when I got nervous. I built a simple story in my head and repeated it until it sounded true. Extreme cold makes people irritable. Night shifts mess with your mind. Isolation makes any noise sound like a person. I read that kind of stuff on health websites, the ones that talk about sleep hygiene and tips for people who work overnight. I even thought about buying one of those therapy lights people use in the winter, but in Alaska that just feels like a joke. But the normal explanation started to fall apart for one reason. I was forgetting details that were too small to forget. The first time, I thought it was just exhaustion. I'd left sub-level 3, climbed the service stairs, and reached the supply room. I always parked the cart the same way, with the bucket on the left and the mop hanging from the hook. When I came back, the cart looked the same, except the mop handle was on the right side. The difference was tiny. Even so, my body reacted like I'd just seen blood on the floor. I stood there staring at the mop like it could explain why it had switched sides. I thought, I must have placed it like that without noticing. And then came the worst feeling. I couldn't remember placing it at all. It started happening on other nights. A cloth folded differently. A cleaner bottle turned to face the wall. A cabinet door I was sure I'd closed, but now it was just resting open. They weren't big changes. They were changes that felt like someone was testing whether I'd notice. I started jotting things down on my phone. Date, time, location. But most places in Site K41 had no signal. So I used a paper notebook in my room and transferred the notes to my phone later, whenever I could catch Wi-Fi in the annex cafeteria early in the morning. It was my way of keeping my head together. Then came the worst kind of failure. The blanks. One night near the end of my shift, I was filling out the daily report. Just a simple sheet with boxes to check. Hallways cleaned, trash collected, anomalies recorded. I always checked no for anomalies, even after seeing weird stuff because I didn't want to seem paranoid. That night I froze with the pen in the air and realized I couldn't clearly remember part of my shift. I remembered coming in, I remembered going down the east hallway. I remembered the lights dimming for 10 seconds. Then, a blank. The next memory was me in sub-level 2, pushing the cart like nothing had happened, hand already sore from scrubbing the floor. I looked at the clock. Almost an hour had passed between one memory and the next. It wasn't like forgetting what I ate for lunch. It was like someone had cut a piece out of my night. I tried to rebuild it. I thought about using the rule notebook as a guide because it had a list of what I was supposed to do at each time. But that only made things worse, because I found things in the notebook that I didn't remember reading, yet felt way too familiar. There was a page marked with a fold in the corner. I don't remember folding any page. And yet there it was, like I had always used that marker. The rule on that page said, if you feel like time is missing, do not try to recover it. Continue the route. The more you look, the more you lose. I read that and felt a cold drop in my stomach. It wasn't a safety warning. It was a warning about my head, about memory. How could someone have written that before I felt it? And why did it feel like I'd already glanced over that page many times? I started to distrust the notebook itself. Not in the sense of thinking it was magical or cursed, but in a simpler way. I no longer knew if that notebook was always the same one. The notes seemed slightly different depending on the day. One night, I was sure a rule said, do not touch the handle with your left hand. The next night, it seemed to say, do not touch the handle without gloves. I could have been mixing it up, of course, but the wording wouldn't stay fixed in my head, and I began to notice something else. I couldn't clearly remember the first day. I remembered Dr. Reeves handing me the badge. I remembered the quick handshake. I remembered the cold in the parking lot and the smell of coffee in the annex. But when I tried to remember his face, no clear image came up. What came instead was a feeling. Glasses, lab coat, calm voice. Loose details, like my mind had only saved what was necessary. The strangest part was that I also didn't remember signing the documents that should have existed. Normally, at any job, there's paperwork. Company rules, confidentiality forms, safety agreements. I remembered sitting at a table and hearing the sound of a pen, but I didn't remember what I wrote. I didn't remember seeing my name on the paper. I only remembered doing it. I tried to talk to Dr. Reeves one morning. I waited for him to show up at the annex like he sometimes did. When he arrived, he looked tired, but in the same proper way as always. I carefully asked about the contract and the rules, like someone just trying to confirm something simple. He looked at me for a second longer than normal and said, "You received everything you needed to receive, Ethan. That's on record." "Recorded where?" I asked. He blinked once slowly and replied, "In the right places." That was supposed to reassure me. Instead, it made me feel like I had asked the wrong question. After that, I stopped trying to talk. I started to observe. I started observing the way I walked because I'd read a rule that said, "Keep a steady pace. Do not run. Do not stop without reason." I didn't know why that mattered, but I began to police myself. I walked at the same speed, like I was on an invisible treadmill. I started observing my silence. I'd always been a quiet guy, but there I became even quieter. I avoided humming. I avoided sighing out loud. I avoided talking to myself even when I wanted to, because there was a rule about not responding to my name, and that put a horrible idea in my head. Maybe the place wasn't only listening for my name. Maybe it was listening to everything. And then there was the badge. I noticed one night in the faint reflection of a glass door that the edge of the badge didn't look as white anymore. It was a subtle change, like the plastic had picked up a cold, slightly bluish tone. I thought about lighting, about shadows, about reflections. I stepped into a brighter hallway and looked again. The tint was still there. I didn't have the courage to take a photo. I just felt the pressure in my chest increase a little, like the badge was more present than it should have been. And I realized the thought I'd been avoiding since the beginning. I didn't know if I was following rules to stay safe, or if I was being trained to act a certain way. And the worst part was that I was doing it very well. After a month, I stopped thinking of Site K41 as a job and started thinking of it as a system. That might sound exaggerated, but it was the only word that fit. A job has tasks. A system has inputs and outputs. You do something, it reacts. You make a mistake, it corrects you. You repeat, it learns. I started noticing that the rules weren't just don't do this. They were more like a way of shaping my behavior. They put me on specific paths at specific times with a specific rhythm. I didn't choose what to do, I just carried out a sequence. And the facility seemed to adjust itself so I would keep carrying it out. The strangest part was that it didn't come with screams, shadows, or things jumping in my face. It came with small cold things. Signs, lights, protocols, warnings. It was the kind of horror that looks like a spreadsheet. And for some reason, that was worse. I realized this one night when I decided to test something simple. Nothing dangerous, nothing heroic. Just a stupid little test to prove to myself that I still had control. The rule said, always clean stairwell 1 from top to bottom. I thought, that's just to keep people from slipping on the water. So I did the opposite. I started from the bottom and worked my way up, very slowly, carefully, ready for someone to show up and scold me. Nothing happened in the first few minutes. I almost laughed to myself in relief. Then, halfway up the stairs, the intercom crackled. It wasn't an announcement. It was just an activation sound, that dry click like someone had pressed a button. I stopped. The click stopped. I took one more step. Another click. I froze with the mop in my hand, trying to connect the dots. I'd never heard that sound before. Not in that kind of situation. What scared me was realizing it didn't sound like a random glitch. It sounded like feedback. A response. I went back to the top of the stairs and started again from top to bottom, just like the rule said. No clicks, no noise, just the normal hum of the place. I finished the stairwell with my heart pounding. Not because I was afraid of dying, but because I was afraid I'd confirm something I didn't want to confirm. The facility knew when I stepped out of pattern, and that changed what the rules were. They weren't there to protect me. They were there to keep my behavior predictable, a way to keep a piece in the right place. That same week, I felt the rule notebook turn into something else in my head. Before, it was a manual. Now it felt like a manual for me, not for cleaning. I started reading rules that felt like they were written as if someone was watching my routine and adjusting the text to push me where they wanted. There was one rule that said, if you feel the urge to look into an unauthorized room, drink water and continue. Another said, if you think you're being watched, count your steps to 20 and resume the route. Who writes a rule like that? That's not lab safety. That's behavioral psychology. I tried to convince myself it was just paranoia, but the place didn't help. Questions started appearing inside the system. I call them questions because they weren't direct orders. They were situations set up to see my response. Like a multiple choice test, except instead of paper, it was the hallway. One night I found a supply room door open. That was unusual. During the day, everything was locked. At night, doors stayed exactly the way I left them. I stopped because opening doors wasn't my job. The rule said, if you find a supply room door open, do not close it, do not enter, mark it, and move on. I did that. I marked it and moved on. But when I reached the end of the hallway, the intercom made a short announcement in that overly clean female voice. Correct procedure. I almost dropped the bucket. It wasn't just that the system spoke. It was what it said. It wasn't an alert. It wasn't a request. It was an evaluation. I felt like a dog that had just sat down and gotten a good boy from something that shouldn't be training any dogs. After that, I started noticing how people acted when I showed up. I almost never saw anyone up close, but when I did, the conversations were too precise. Once a tech in a blue lab coat passed me on sub-level 3 and said, "Good evening, Mr. Ethan Cole. Your performance is within expected parameters." He said my full name like he was reading it off a sheet. I didn't reply because my body had already learned not to react. I just kept walking, but I heard him repeat, to no one in particular, "Within expected parameters." Then it went quiet. I really wanted to believe he was just a strange guy. But nobody talks like that. Not in the military, not in school, not in a job interview. It sounded like report language. And then came the conclusion that knocked the air out of me for a few seconds. The place didn't just want me to clean. The place wanted me to be a pattern. It wasn't, "Don't do this so you don't die." It was, "Don't do this so you don't change what you are." When I thought about that, I thought about the badge. I felt it heavy on my chest, like a real physical weight. I started noticing how central it was to everything. Cameras seemed to follow it, not my face. Doors unlocked because of it, not because of me. And I started to suspect something in a very simple way. Maybe I wasn't the employee. Maybe the badge was. I started looking at Site K41 like a big machine. I was a small part moving through the corridors. My routine was a kind of scan. If I passed through the right places, at the right times, the system received information. If I changed the route, it noticed and reacted. It was a logical kind of horror. There were no hoods, no teeth, no shadow behind me. There were rules, schedules, lights, a voice over the speakers, words like procedure, protocol, compliance. And in the middle of all that, the idea I'd been avoiding became clear, simple, and impossible to unsee. I wasn't working there. I was being studied. And the worst part was that I didn't know by whom or for what purpose. I only knew that every time I obeyed, the place stayed calm. And every time I even thought about disobeying, the place responded too fast to be a coincidence. So I went back to obeying. Not because I believed in the rules, but because I wanted to keep being myself, at least for one more night. The night of the event started like all the others, and that's what scared me the most afterward. I entered through the service door between 10:00 p.m. and 11:00 p.m., passed through the air chamber, felt the cold light sweep over my clothes, and pushed the cleaning cart into the white hallway. The hum of the place was there, normal, like it was saying. Everything the same. I checked the notebook before starting out of habit. It was a Thursday. Thursday routes were always long. Sub-level 4 first, then sub-level 3, and finally the connecting corridor that I hated because it always felt colder, even with the system running. I read the rules the way you glance at road signs. I no longer believed in them as tips. I believed in them as limits. At 11:17 p.m. I noticed the first thing that was wrong. The digital clock on sub-level 4 was showing the time, but the temperature field was blank. Not 0, not error, blank. Like someone had erased just that number. I stood there staring at it for a ridiculous amount of time, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. I wrote it down on my pocket paper. Clock no temp, 11:17. My hand was shaking a little, and I got angry at myself. I wasn't a kid. I was taking notes like a detective, like that was going to save me. At 11:45 p.m., the lights dimmed for 10 seconds, like always. I kept walking, like the rule said. But this time, it wasn't just a drop in brightness. It was like the color shifted slightly, leaning toward a faint blue. When it came back, it was normal again. I stopped and thought, maybe I'm getting obsessed. Maybe I'm seeing color where there isn't any. I wanted that to be true. Right at midnight, the intercom crackled. I'd heard it speak before, but it was always that neutral voice, evaluating, testing. This time, the voice was different for a simple reason. It was Dr. Malcolm Reeves's voice. "Ethan Cole, go to the cryogenics laboratory, now." I stood there with the mop in my hand and my heart racing. The cryogenics lab was a place I only ever saw from the outside. Reinforced door, sensor, red sign, and a very clear rule. Never enter rooms with a red triangle, even if someone asks for help. I opened the notebook with stiff fingers and read the rule again, like it might change. It didn't. I heard the voice again, exactly the same, with that same calm tone Dr. Reeves always had. "Ethan, this is a procedure, not a request." That was when I felt the strangest thing of the night. It wasn't fear. It was like noticing a math error. I knew Dr. Reeves's voice was real, because I'd heard it many times, but I also knew the intercom wasn't supposed to work at that hour. And I knew the notebook said not to respond to announcements outside protocol hours. 3 things were true at the same time, and one of them had to be wrong. I didn't respond. I kept pushing the cart, slowly, pretending my job was still cleaning. The voice went silent for a few seconds. Then it tried a different tone, more human, almost tired. "Ethan, I know you're confused. I need you to come. What's happening here can't get out of control." I stopped for a second. I felt the urge to obey, like that sentence fit into my head like a puzzle piece. And then I realized what it was. It wasn't an order. It was a sentence designed to unlock my instinct to follow authority. The place didn't just want my body, it wanted the right response. I kept walking. When I turned the corner, I saw something that wasn't on my map, a green light on above a storage door. I knew green lights. The notebook said that if they called my full name, I was supposed to run to the nearest green room and lock myself inside. But no one had said my full name, and the green light wasn't supposed to be on in that corridor. I stood there trying to decide if the door was a trap or a shelter. And at that exact moment, my badge vibrated against my chest like it had taken a weak electric shock. I pulled the badge up and looked at it. The plastic was bluer than before. It wasn't a reflection. It wasn't a shadow. It was the color actually changing very slowly, like ink spreading in water. The notebook said in plain letters, "If the badge changes color, exit through the nearest emergency exit." I had never seen that rule happen to me. I'd always treated it like over-the-top manual stuff. Now it was happening, and that made my mind go clear for a moment. It wasn't paranoia. It was a condition. I looked at the emergency arrow at the end of the hallway. I knew where the door was. I also knew that to get there, I'd have to pass through an area where I'd already heard my name called before, and I didn't want to imagine what might be there now. The hallway lights flickered once, and this time the blue color came back stronger. Not 10 seconds. A pulse like the building had glanced at me. The intercom spoke again with Dr. Reeves's voice, but with one difference that made my skin crawl. It was slightly tuned, like someone had adjusted the voice to sound more convincing. "You're scared because of the rules. The rules are just for your routine. I'm your supervision." I felt like laughing from nerves because it was ridiculous. At the same time, it was perfect. It was exactly the kind of sentence someone would say if they'd been reading my mind for the past few weeks. And that's when I understood. It wasn't a boss talking to me. It was a system trying to push me back into the pattern. I did the only thing I still could. I used logic against it. I spoke quietly to myself, but loud enough for the microphone if it was listening. "If you're Dr. Reeves, why are you using the intercom at a time when it's supposed to be off?" Silence. I went on. "And if this is a procedure, why is my badge changing color? I'm not the one who changes the badge color, the site does. So the site wants me out, not in." The silence got heavy, like something had locked up. The blue lights pulsed harder, and for a second I felt the hallway air turn colder, like the temperature had dropped fast. I didn't see monsters. I didn't see shadows running. I just saw the system get irritated. The voice came back, but it wasn't perfect anymore. There was a small delay between the words, like a video with bad internet. "Ethan, return to your work." I didn't argue anymore. I ran for the emergency exit. The door bar was stiff, like it was stuck. I pushed with all my strength and nothing happened. My heart jumped into my throat. Behind me, the voice on the intercom shifted back to a clean tone again, like it had recovered. "You can't leave during a procedure." I pressed my hand against the emergency reader next to the door, more out of instinct than knowing what I was doing. The badge vibrated again, and the reader beeped. The lock clicked. The door opened. It wasn't relief. It was confirmation. I ran up the emergency stairs to the external annex, and when I opened the last door, the Alaska wind hit me in the face like a slap. Outside, the sky was dark, full of clouds, and the snow was falling lightly, without a sound. I took a deep breath and felt my throat burn. I looked back just once. Through the open doorway, the hallway below had a faint bluish glow, like the normal light had been replaced by something else. It didn't look like an electrical accident. It looked like a mode. I closed the door and stood outside, shaking, holding the badge in my hand. The blue color was still there, vivid, like it wasn't paint, like it was a warning. Right there, in the cold, without needing any more proof, I understood. Site K41 wasn't just having problems. It had changed states. And I had just seen that the rules weren't there to save me from the place. They were there to keep the place the way it wanted. I didn't go back to Site K41 that night. I spent hours sitting in the external annex, with the wind hitting the thin walls and the distant sound of the system working under the ice. No one came after me. No alarm went off. No sirens. Somehow, That was more frightening than if they had tried to stop me. When the sky started to lighten, a white Jeep stopped near the Alpha Ridge control post. The driver didn't introduce himself. He just said I needed to go with him. I thought about running, but to where? Snow, forest, cold. I got into the vehicle because it was that or freezing. The drive was short. We didn't go to Fairbanks. We went to another annex, smaller, older, far from the main access. Inside, the heat was weak, and the place smelled like old paper and metal. A man I didn't know handed me a cup of coffee and told me to wait. After a while, Dr. Malcolm Reeves appeared, or someone who looked exactly like him. Same face, same voice, same calm way of speaking. Whether it was the same person or not, I was no longer sure of anything. He didn't apologize, he didn't explain. He just said, "You reacted in an unexpected, but acceptable way." Acceptable. That word made my stomach turn again. He explained that I could no longer work at Site K41, not as a night janitor. He said my profile had been updated and that I would be reassigned to another role at another location. I asked if that was my choice. He answered, "It's the best use for you." I didn't sign anything. They didn't ask for a signature. I was just given a new badge and a new notebook, a bit thicker than the previous one. The cover was gray with no markings at all. Dr. Reeves said I should read the rules carefully, but without trying to interpret them beyond what was necessary. I flipped through the new notebook right there on the cold table. The rules were different. They no longer talked about cleaning. They talked about observation, waiting shifts, simple reports. One said, "If you notice changes in the environment's behavior, record them without reacting." Another, "Do not try to warn external people. Most don't notice." I looked at him and asked what Site K41 actually was. He took a little longer to answer this time. Then he said, "It's not a place. It's a process." I thought about the voice on the intercom, the blue light, the way the system reacted when I stepped out of pattern. I thought about the puddle that vanished, the badge changing color, the rules that seemed to know too much. I slowly understood that this had never been about containing something underground. It was about learning. I was taken to another place in Alaska, far from K41 but not far from the ice. My new workplace was simple, a monitoring station, the kind scattered across the state, collecting data on soil, temperature, and seismic activity. Nothing flashy, nothing secret at first glance. My job now was to stay up at night, sitting in a room with screens, logging patterns, not fixing, not intervening, just observing. The notebook explained that certain changes weren't failures, they were responses, and that I needed to learn how to recognize when the environment was adjusting. At first, I thought this was just a way to keep me busy, away from K41, but over time, I noticed the data I saw didn't match the public reports. Small variations that only showed up there. Rhythms that repeated at strange intervals. Like something was testing limits, not of machines, but of human attention. One night, I found an old note buried in a forgotten file on the station's computer. It was a report signed by someone named Dr. Laura Vance. The name sent a chill down my spine because I vaguely remembered seeing it somewhere at Site K41, maybe on a sign, maybe in a rule. The report talked about reactive environments and how the ice wasn't meant to contain but to slow down. There was one sentence underlined several times. "The system isn't trapped here. It's learning to move." I closed the file and stared at the screens, at the calm lines rising and falling. Too calm. I thought of Site K41 as an experiment that had gone wrong. Then I realized that was a lie. It had gone too right. The ice wasn't a prison. It was temporary isolation, a way to reduce stimuli while something learned how to deal with rules, with routine, with human behavior. And I had been one of those lessons. I kept working, because now I understood the game better than before. It wasn't courage, it wasn't loyalty, it was adaptation. Sometimes when the shift is too quiet, I feel the same kind of active silence I felt in the K41 hallways. Not empty. Watching. I follow the rules. I log what I see. I don't ask unnecessary questions. I still have the first badge tucked away in a drawer wrapped in cloth. The blue color never faded, no matter how much I wash or scrub. It's like it's not a stain, but a permanent state. I'm not telling this story to warn anyone. Most people wouldn't believe it, and honestly, I don't think it would matter. The system doesn't need everyone. It only needs a few who know how to observe without panicking. The world hasn't ended. People still go to work, watch TV, complain about the cold, plan vacations. Fairbanks is still there. Anchorage is still there. Everything seems normal. But now I know there's something working behind all of this. Learning patterns, testing limits, adjusting rules. Not like a monster, not like a god, but like a cold, patient process. I follow my routine. I observe. I wait. And sometimes, when the station lights shift in tone for a few seconds, I don't get scared. I just write it down. Because now I know the ice never contained anything. It only bought time to learn.